and a very beautiful community. It's a while since we looked at what the hell is going on in Russia. So let's talk about what I think is a looming but perhaps slow burning problem that Putin has with the Russian people. We'll look with a couple of pinches of salt at a little bit of polling analysis, very briefly. And then we'll talk about what Putin's problem is, what that means for the future of his regime, and what takeaways we in the West can derive from this, because we are ourselves sinking into problems with authoritarianism and then depoliticization on the part of our populations in response to the authoritarianism. This won't be a long chat. So let's sit ourselves, tuck ourselves in, and look at this bit of polling analysis from Russia, which is one of the excellent resources for making sense of Russia. Now, it's very difficult to do polls under conditions of authoritarian rule, and it's difficult to do polls under conditions of authoritarian rule plus radical depoliticization. But there have been folks who've done really good polling work in Russia during the war, and you're often seeing sort of innovative ways of going about it that try to get people to articulate themselves without asking them a direct question or asking them subsidiary questions that check their relationship to the first question you asked them about. Now, here we've got two very, very, very interesting questions. They're not about whether people oppose or support Putin or the war. They are about support in your social circle for the war. Now, there is then a second question, which is very interesting, and that's, what's your sense of what they think in the Kremlin? Do they support or oppose the war in the Kremlin? So I don't like to edit the chats in any way, but I'm going to just put on the screen a presentation of this data so that we can talk about it for a couple of minutes and then get a bit of analysis in. So in your social circle, do people support or oppose the war? And here the answer comes back, 50% say, yeah, most in my social circle seem to support the war. 27% say it's 50-50 or it's a mixed environment. 13% say most in my social circle don't support the war. So an interesting takeaway from this is that you've got 40% of Russians, with a pinch of salt going on this data, say there is no majority in my social circle that supports the war. 40% of Russians are saying that. Now there's a very interesting second question. Do you think there's a majority inside the Kremlin who support the war? 47% of Russians, with two pinches of salt, are saying, yeah, I reckon most in the Kremlin support the war. 27% of Russians say, yeah, I reckon it's 50-50 or a mixed environment in the Kremlin. And 5% say most in the Kremlin, I'd guess, don't support the war. So we've got 1/3 of Russians saying they don't believe there's a majority in the Kremlin that supports the war. Now, let's analyze this a little bit. And perhaps we can throw in my sort of derivation of the more responsible polls done over the last months and couple of years, which tend to suggest that perhaps half of Russians answer with an attitude of fatigue to the war, saying it'd be kind of good if it stopped. And then if you add to that Russians who say they'd like the war stopped, but only if Putin did it, that becomes not 50, but 70 or 80%. Now, there's a big qualification here. The 50% who say, whatever Putin's current position, I'd like the war to stop, are not saying stop the war for me now. What they're really saying, once we properly understand the radical depoliticization in Russia, is I want Putin to want to stop the war. You understand the difference. The difference goes to the heart, right, of a kind of monarchical conception of legitimacy. Yeah, I can sort of imagine wanting the war to stop even if Putin doesn't want it now, but the only politically meaningful way in which I can take that is to wish for Putin to wish to stop the war. But nevertheless, if we take that as a 70 or 80% number, that's a number that Putin, who is obsessive with polls, will have in mind in a way that reminds him of the Crimean consensus. The Crimean consensus, when Putin's popularity spiked to something like 80%, is one of the most important sort of visual image type imprints in his mind for the duration of his entire presidency. It's extremely evocative for him. He thinks about it all the time. He loves the idea of it, and he compares his predicament today to it. We've got a degree of depoliticized war fatigue that statistically is reminiscent of another number, and that's Putin's Crimean consensus. Now, it's also worth pointing out the way Russians received the acquisition of Crimea in 2014, and that's that they, to a good extent, received it the way a company receives getting a deal that another company could have got, was competing for, but didn't, and you got it. That's how the acquisition of Crimea in part feels to Russians. That's a testament to what we call a kind of hyper-neoliberal politics, a politics where you think that might is right. Now, the re-Russia stats we need to think about in the context of things the word we've already mentioned many times in this chat, and that's depoliticization. Because they are against the background of a kind of consumerist monarchism. We get on with our private lives, we consume, or if things don't go well, we get into debt, and the leader decides. Get on with our private lives, the leader decides. Now, the legitimacy of the leader's decision does not come from it being right or from it being popular. The legitimacy comes from the very fact that it's a decision that the leader made. Unpopularity or wrongness can't be an objection to a leader's decision because they don't touch on legitimacy, because your model of legitimacy is that what makes something legitimate is that the leader has decided so. The core of legitimacy is accepting not the result, but the process that generated the result. And if you unquestionably accept the process of Putin as the only institution with perceived legitimacy in the country doing something, if you accept that as really the only grasp you have on a notion of legitimacy, then you have to accept whatever he does. But despite this, that palpable fatigue is, I think, a problem for him. And it's not an accident that I'm sort of aligning it with this Crimean figure that's stuck in Putin's mind, because it's bound to alarm Putin, the degree of fatigue. Now, I think that the current situation is not stably sustainable for Putin. I also think that Putin thinks that. Therefore, Putin cannot carry on the war with things exactly as they are in Russian society indefinitely. He's going to need to engage in more repression. At the same time, Putin also can't stably stop the war in the current environment because of the degree of divisiveness in society about the war. If Putin carries on the war, he's going to have to engage in more repression. If Putin stops the war, he's going to have to engage in more repression. That's my analysis and my sense of his analysis too. Therefore, the rather fanciful thoughts that if Trump allows Russia to, in some way, re-enter relations with the West, it doesn't follow from that there's going to be a kind of easing of political pressure within Russia. I think that Putin is going to have to both dramatize repression in individual cases and scale it up, whatever he does with the war. So that's something that will have to evolve because keeping things as they are will prove not quite sustainable for him, it seems to me. Now, what are the takeaways for us? Well, the takeaway for us is that consumerist monarchism is taking root in the West too, and right now it's taking root in the United States. And so the idea is that you get somebody in and you give them increasingly, you hope they acquire for themselves increasingly unbounded power, hoping that you can vote them out if you don't like it. The trouble with that thought is it doesn't reckon properly with how far democracy can actually be used to end democracy. But we're absolutely in the West ideologically swimming in some of the same disease that on a higher plane Russian society is swimming in. We've got, let's use some horrific jargon, we've got hyper-individualism, the idea that really only you matter and you should only think about yourself, taking more root in our society. We've got a kind of scientistic neoliberalism that's dramatically expressed in the more ideological wing of the Trump administration, which is the idea that you can just run a country like you run a corporation. And we've got hyper-neoliberalism, the idea that might is right and that legitimacy just derives from folks who have power exercising power because we live in a world in which there are no values, only interests. And what comes from this is the enormous risk in the United States and elsewhere in the West, when more of our own Trumps in other European countries come to power, is that we respond with depoliticization to the increasingly authoritarian turns in our democracies. It's a very, very, very big risk. And in many ways, that journey that Russia took from the 90s until its current predicament is a journey that we can't repeat because there are some special conditions for that the Russians faced and some special cultural deformations that they have, which we don't. But on the whole, it's a trajectory that in some parts we're at risk of repeating. And that's why the kind of conversation we're now having about the spectacularly depoliticized sort of pseudo-opposition in Russia to Putin's war, whereby you wanted to stop, but you really wanted to stop by wanting Putin to want to stop it. That kind of stuff is very interesting for us to observe because, quite frankly, these are waters where the Russians are deep onto their neck, and we're slowly approaching maybe even not ankle but knee depth in these waters. Lots of love, beautiful community.